Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome once again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast about Knoxville news and events brought to you by the fine folks from CompassKnox.com, which is me, Jesse Mayshark, and my friend, colleague, co-publisher, co-everything, Scott Barker. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm recovering from election night. We taped this on Fridays. Thursday was election day, and it was a long night.
It was a long night. I think that, one of the nice things about being our own bosses is that we get to set our own schedules a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. One of the not so nice things about being our own bosses is that we're pretty hard taskmasters. We don't pay ourselves overtime or
no. It's we've got some jerks for bosses. I think sometimes I think they make us work at.
We should think about unionizing maybe.
We should.
Or something. What's that? There's that old the saying that people become entrepreneurs so they can work for themselves for 80 hours a week instead of working for somebody else for 40 hours a week. And we can verify that.
That's true,
especially on weeks like this one. Nevertheless, we were of course happy to provide full election coverage at CompassKnox.com, which if you're a subscriber, hopefully you have already read. And if you are not a subscriber, now's a great time. You can get on there and see our full analysis of the elections. And we'll certainly be talking about that today. We also have an interview this week with outgoing school board member Evetty Satterfield, a little bit of an exit interview as she wrapped up her one and only term on school board. Speaking of schools, we have some news about the school system as they're preparing to open for classes on Monday. And we also, just today on Friday, got some new developments in the downtown stadium issue.
Yes, we did.
So we'll be talking about that as well. But let's start right out by talking about the elections. I thought they were pretty interesting. What did you think?
Overall, it wasn't a huge surprise that Republicans swept the county-wide seats, as they have for years and years now. It's been, 2006, I believe, the last time a Democrat won a county-wide office. Yeah. So now the margins were smaller. Mm-hmm. The Democrats did a better job getting out their voters. They had really good candidates this time around. And most of the races were contested. That's not been the case in years past in some instances. So while the overall picture doesn't change dramatically, I think that that it's getting interesting politically as Democrats are trying to gain momentum for the 2 years from now and 4 years from now.
Yeah, and I think the best illustration of that in a lot of ways was the county mayor's race, where County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, as I think we and pretty much everybody expected, won a second term. And it wasn't super close. He won by a 10-point margin, 55% to 45% over Democrat Debbie Helsley. But in his first run in 2018, he won 66% of the vote against Democrat Linda Haney. So that's his margin of victory literally got cut in, well, more than half.
More than half, yeah.
Went from 33 points to 10 points. That's a big drop.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, and again, to expand that out to more races, 4 years ago these same seats were up. In the countywide races that Republicans ran in and won that were contested, they won all of them, and their margins of victory were much larger. All of them got more than 60%, some of them 66, 67% of the vote. This time around, nobody got 60% of the vote in the countywide races.
Yep.
And so the margins of victory were much smaller. 15% was the largest margin. That's still a pretty good margin.
Sure.
But it's smaller than it has been in years past.
Well, and I think when we talk about margins, the thing for people to always keep in mind is that you talk about a 10-point margin, say, and that sounds big, but the reality is you only have to flip 5% for that to be essentially tied.
Right.
Because, if you add every vote that you add on your side is one that comes away from the other side. And, I think that, of course, the Democrats are going to be trumpeting these results as sort of vindication and validation for their efforts this year. And I think Republicans, certainly a lot of the Republicans at the Crowne Plaza on Thursday night, where they had their election night party, acknowledged that. They said, yeah, those guys, Matt Shears, who's the Democratic county chair, like, they're organized, they're energized, and there were some Republicans, even during their victory speeches, there were a few Republicans that said, we kind of need to up our game here a little bit because the Democrats are coming at us. Now, it would be easy to exaggerate this. It's a bit of an off election anyway. Turnout for this particular cycle is often pretty low. It was even low. Overall turnout was down from these races 4 years ago. But what it looks like is that was not down proportionately, that probably the Republican turnout was down a lot more than the Democratic turnout. The Democratic turnout may have actually been higher than it was 4 years ago. And so if you have sort of Republican turnout going down at the same time as Democratic turnout coming up, you're going to see that narrowing of margins. That doesn't necessarily mean that the next time you have an election where Republicans are really more motivated to vote, that you're going to see the same thing. These things can vary a lot from sort of cycle to cycle.
Yeah. But one thing, you're absolutely right. Democrats last night, I was at the Redbud Kitchen in South Knoxville where they had their post-election party, and it was a party. They were celebrating. It was almost like they had won all these races instead of losing most of them. That was they really they're already talking about the elections 2 years from now, and so they're they are celebrating as though they had won. So I mean, you talking about they really were spinning it that it was practically a victory.
Well, and I think one thing that we're likely to see out of it, we'll have to wait and see, but this will probably make it easier for the Democrats to recruit candidates, because that's been one of their big challenges, especially in those countywide races, which can be expensive and are difficult to run across a whole county with 480,000 people in it. And it has seemed a little bit like you're putting yourself up to be a sacrificial lamb in the past. People often don't want to devote a year of their lives to something just to make a symbolic gesture. And I think it'll be easier for the Democratic Party now to go out and, try to recruit quote unquote good candidates who are maybe well known in the community, candidates who maybe have, some financial resources of their own, people who would only be interested if they thought there was a real shot at winning. It'll be easier for the Democrats now to go to those candidates and say, look, we can put this together for you and make this a competitive race. So let's talk about a couple of the races that were especially kind of close and interesting. There were two what I would call upsets in the results. One of them was an intramural Republican race, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the 4th District school board race. And of course, this is, again, the first year in 20 plus years that we've had partisan school board races. And so that it's kind of changed the landscape. The 4th District covers West Knoxville from Sequoia Hills kind of out through Rocky Hill, Bluegrass, in that area. Also includes West Hills. And that district has been sort of a traditional Republican district that's been trending more and more blue. Actually, the district voted just barely for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. That seemed like a little bit of an outlier, maybe some anti-Trump Republicans crossing over and so forth. But in this race, we had Republican Will Edwards versus Democrat Catherine Bike. Neither of them had run for office before. Edwards raised a tremendous amount of money, a record-setting amount of money, more than $100,000 for a district school board race, unheard of in Knox County. Catherine Bike raised a decent amount, around $30,000, which would normally be considered a healthy
that's not bad
for a school board race. But Catherine Bike won by a narrow margin, like 137 votes, 51% to 49%. But I think that surprised a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it did too. First of all, as you said, that it does tend to be a Republican district, and Edwards raised so much money. I mean, more than $100,000 for a district race is, as you said, it's unprecedented for a school board race. But Bike got out and knocked on doors and really worked hard. It's what all of her colleagues in the Democratic Party at the party last night said that. She just went out and worked for the votes in the kind of the traditional way, kind of getting back to the whole Democratic momentum thing. One of the things that Matt Shears, the head of the local Democratic Party, said was, coming into the election, their goals were to get 40% of the vote or more countywide. They did, and then win one down ballot race, and they did. So that's one of the reasons they were so happy, is they did meet their goals. Modest goals, yes, but they met them. And that race was, it was very interesting in that hard work beat money, essentially.
Well, hard work, and also, there's all these X factors that are hard, that you can kind of intuit, but are hard to know for sure how they affect things. For example, is the Democratic electorate overall across the country just really energized now by, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, by the January 6th hearings? Typically, in these sort of midterm election cycles, it's the party out of power in Washington that is most motivated because they want to win things back. And it does make you wonder if some of that is being offset by other factors making Democratic voters particularly attuned even to things like local races and school board races that they might not typically come out for. I also think that it suggests some interesting things about this shift to partisan school board races. I think that in doing that, the state legislature, which, this was pushed by the Republican supermajority, their hope was that by forcing school board candidates to declare party allegiance, that would mostly benefit Republicans, because Tennessee is a mostly Republican state. Knox County is a mostly Republican county. But when you come down to districts that are maybe not, that are more mixed, which the 4th District certainly is. As I said, it's been a traditional Republican district, but has been trending blue. That can work, for you or against you, depending on how those larger, like in a typical school board race, a nonpartisan school board race, people motivated by partisan issues, motivated Democratic voters, wouldn't necessarily have a school board candidate to go and support to kind of show that they were, just venting their overall feelings or frustrations about things. And so the result of that is that we're now going to have functionally a 5-member Republican majority on the 9-member school board, which is a pretty close divide. Like, that's a much closer divide than county commission, for example, where you have 2 Democratic commissioners out of 11.
Yeah, and one of the external issues, it's not really external, but it's an issue that that might have played a role in this race and in the 9th District race, which Christie won. She's the Republican incumbent, barely.
Yeah,
it was a very close race, and that is school choice. The charter schools in particular, because recently we had Larry Arnn, the president of Fieldsville College, and close education advisor to Governor Bill Lee, disparaged teachers publicly, and Lee, basically didn't call him out on it. Just and so you don't know how that played into it a little bit, since these are school board races.
Sure.
Yeah, but it could have had a factor. And those two races were so close that you got to believe that a few voters were swayed that way.
Well, I think that and I have wondered about this, the school voucher and charter school, the whole school choice issue. The reality is that vouchers in particular, but charter schools too, have not actually been super popular with the electorate at large. Like, there's no evidence that Tennesseans as a whole are in favor of school vouchers or want to see more charter schools. When Bill Lee pushed, arm twisted, whatever else he did to get his voucher program through just a few years ago, through the Republican supermajority, he barely got it passed. He had to twist a lot of arms, and he was only able to do it by promising literally every Republican representative and senator that it was not going to affect them and their schools and their school systems. It was only going to affect majority Democratic Nashville and Memphis. And so that was a signal just a few years ago that there was an awful lot of trepidation and uncertainty about this whole idea of kind of school privatization, of using public money to pay for private school tuition, all those kinds of ideas. And now, just a few years later, the Republican Party and Republican school board candidates, certainly here, have mostly moved to supporting and embracing vouchers and or charter schools. And they may be a little bit ahead of the electorate on that. Those issues, I have a feeling that in the 4th District, for example, very affluent, very educated district, I'm not sure that being the candidate in favor of school vouchers, which Will Edwards essentially was, is necessarily, a winning move. Obviously, we'll have to see some more cycles play out with these partisan school board races, but it definitely raised a lot of questions.
Well, and it kind of goes back to the kind of one of the tropes that people bring up is everybody believes that the school system is failing, except for their kids' schools.
Right.
My kid goes to a good school. It's those other schools that are failing, and I think that when confronted with it in your own school system, you might go, well, I don't know if that's such a good idea, and I think you're right. I think that basically the electorate doesn't really want to go for the
or at least has a lot of questions and uncertainty about how it's going to affect them. And all right, let's.
The other race that we were going to talk about was the 18th district race.
Yes, so the 18th district primary between City Councilwoman Janet Testerman and conservative Republican Party activist Elaine Davis. Also very interesting. Also a race where one of the candidates, Testerman, literally raised more than twice as much money. She had over $140,000 in contributions from a wide swath of, what you would call or what we used to call, maybe we're going to change the name.
We might have to now.
The Republican establishment, by which we mean sort of, the Haslam family, kind of the whole nexus of West Knoxville, old Republican money, which has been a guiding, if not dominant, factor in local politics for many years. They all supported Janet Testerman, as many of them also supported Will Edwards in that school board race. And yet, Elaine Davis not only won, she won pretty convincingly. She won by a 12-point margin. She won 56 to 44%. What do you make of that?
Part of it is the redistricting, because I think they brought in while the district does contain a lot of old money Republicans, now it also contains a lot of more rural Republicans in South Knox County who might look a little more suspiciously on the old West Knoxville money, if we can generalize it like that. But I think it also reflects a shift in the Republican electorate a little bit, because Elaine Davis is much more of a
kind of a Trump Republican.
And Testerman is much more moderate. She positioned herself as more of a conservative for this race, but I think she's perceived as being more moderate than Davis is, and that was
certainly Davis's attack against Testerman.
That
she had mostly supported City Mayor India Kincannon's agenda and efforts, and that she was not a quote unquote real Republican.
Right, and it resonated with the voters, because they, as you said, voted for her convincingly in this race. One interesting point that has come up, especially since the election ended the way it did, is what Janet Testerman, what her future looks like. There were several Democrats who said that the way that she ran and and trying to set that more conservative tone, that's going to ruin her if she runs for re-election for a city council seat, because the city electorate is much more Democratic leaning, even though the races are nonpartisan. But she's an unusual character in the cast of city council members, because there are only a couple of them who'd be considered Republicans, and she was one of them.
Yeah, and she'd be up for election next year, right?
Yes.
So she's going to have to make that decision here in the not too distant future, whether she wants to subject herself to another race after losing this one.
And funny, she runs this one, she gets attacked from the right. She runs that one, she's going to be attacked from the left.
Yeah. So. Well, and I think that does illustrate sort of the position that a lot of more moderate, more what you might call traditional East Tennessee Republicans have found themselves in recent years, where they don't exactly have a home. I think that was a factor in Eddie Manis losing the city mayor's race a few years ago. He was the kind of moderate Republican who used to win city races all the time, and it's gotten harder for them to win city races, but it's also gotten harder for them to win races outside the city, where the Republican electorate wants somebody a little more vocal and in the Trump mold. Another race I think we need to mention, which was also very close, is the 3rd District County Commission race, which again, very traditional Republican seat. 3rd District has been represented by Republicans on County Commission forever, as long as I know, certainly for as long as I've been aware of County Commission. And Randy Smith, the incumbent, was term limited and did not run for re-election. Gina Oster, the Republican candidate, who's run a couple of previous races and not won them, just like Elaine Davis, actually.
Right.
She won, but just barely. She won by 89 votes over Democrat Stuart Hall. I think that's a case where, because that district itself has actually gotten a little bit more Republican since they redrew it last year, because it had to take in some voters from the West in more Republican areas. And even at that, she barely won. I think the Democrats would probably look at that and say, aha, that district is going blue and is very winnable. I think there's some other factors here where Oster in particular is a little bit of a divisive figure. She's been very outspoken in the past. Some of the battles over the Sheriff's Merit System Council, for example, she was the chair of that. It's not a secret that there are some Republicans, including some Republicans on County Commission, for example, who are not big fans of Oster. And so I think that Stuart Hall, the Democratic candidate, who by all accounts worked very hard, I don't think he would have gotten as close as he did without that, but also probably benefited from some Republican crossover voting there from people who where it was an issue with Oster herself rather than the electorate as a whole.
Yeah, I think that there were a couple things. I think he was a really good candidate. He's very personable, very engaging. He worked really hard. He comes across as being a pro-business Democrat, not a radical leftist, and so I think that went to his advantage. He also raised a lot of money. So, in fact, Democrats as a whole raised a lot of money this time. They made that funding made several races more competitive than they would have otherwise been.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Well, and a couple other notes just to mention here. One thing that Oster's victory means is that now, for the first time in history, Knox County Commission is going to have a majority of women on it. We're going to have 6 women and 5 men, because we had 3 women elected on Thursday, joining the 3 who are already there, Daisha Lundy, Courtney Durrett, and Terry Hill. That'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to vote together. Durrett and Lundy are Democrats, among other things, and so we'll see how all that works. But it is going to change, I feel like, just the dynamic of that body. And it's also interesting, this means that now all of our local legislative bodies have women majorities on them. The school board is going to go from a 7-2 female majority to a 6-3 majority, and city council also has a, I guess, 6-3, right, because you've got Andrew Roberto and Tommy Prince and Charles Thomas, right? So that's a big change. City council. I think the school board was the first of these bodies to go majority female, but even that was within the last 15 years.
And then council just recently did. So,
right, exactly.
And it was Tommy Smith, by the way.
Sorry,
you said
Tommy Prince.
Yes.
Got Tommy's on the brain. There's a flashback. Tommy Prince used to be on the school board. And I think another thing that we ought to mention is Eric Wyattor. Tell me about Eric Wyattor.
Eric Wyattor is, he's a political consultant. He's worked behind the scenes for the last several elections for the Republicans. He tends to work with the more conservative,
sort of the non-establishment
conservative candidates. He had been successful in county elections. He was very active in the city election, which was nonpartisan, supposedly.
This is the election last year.
This is the election last year, and the Republican Party basically backed candidates in it. Eric worked for them, and there was a big push for them, and they lost.
Right.
And lost convincingly, and so there was a little talk about, well, is Eric Wyattor really that effective? There were a couple other issues that he backed that did not. He
opposed the baseball stadium.
He opposed the baseball stadium. He was also the driving force behind the movement to try to cap the city's property tax rate, which failed. It was going to have to be a referendum and didn't get to the ballot. So there was, I think, some talk that Eric was a little overrated and all, but last night his candidates won.
For Elaine Davis,
yes,
Gina Oster, Rhonda Lee, who was not opposed on Thursday, but she had a 3-way Republican primary in the commission's 7th district. All of them won. He's also working with Dave Posibut, who is going to be the Republican candidate in the 90th state House district. That one's going to be a little tougher because that district, as it appears to be drawn, has a pretty strong Democratic skew. But still, it was definitely a good night for Wyattor, to the extent that Daniel Herrera, the Knox County Republican chairman, who's also been a little bit embattled himself in various ways, but he kind of shouted from the stage Thursday night, "Who says Eric Wyattor can't win races?" And last night he definitely did. So I'm sure if anything, we're going to see more of Eric
Yes.
Wyattor. I think more candidates are likely to be seeking him out, and it'd be interesting to see how that goes. Well, we could probably talk a lot about other things in the election because it was an interesting night, but in the interest of expediency, we should move on to some other things. We just mentioned the stadium. Just got some news about that on Friday. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this kind of goes back to something we'd already reported. We had reported that because of materials cost increases, the cost of the stadium would rise, and we by several million. We don't know how much. We still don't know how much. But we also reported that there were talks that Randy Boyd, was the owner of the Tennessee Smokies, was going to loan the money to the city and the county, or to the Sports Authority, which is a city-county joint venture, to pay for the increased costs. He was going to loan money to them. They would pay him back over time. We reported that nobody would go on the record with their name attached to it at the time, but they were in talks. And then on Friday, did announce that indeed that is going to happen. Boyd is going to pay for the increased costs up front. And
we still don't know how much that's going to be.
We still don't know how much that's going to be. Materials costs have increased about 20% overall on average in the past year. And if the costs just go up 20%, which I don't think they will, because you've got other costs involved too, then we're getting close to $100 million on the stadium. So, and that would be a $20 million loan or a $16 million loan that Boyd will be making. We don't know if it's going to be that much, but anyway, in order, of course, the city and the county are going to have to pay that back somehow. In order to do that, they're going to expand a tax increment financing district around the stadium. We'd already reported that too. That was approved by County Commission, City Council a while back. But they're going to expand that, and basically what that means is the areas within the tax increment financing zone, the new developments there, the tax revenues from that will go toward
the increased property tax.
The increased property tax revenues will go toward the stadium and other improvements in the area.
Right, which makes sense because TIFs and pilots, I mean, the reason that governments like to use those is that they don't require upfront funding. You're basically committing future potential tax revenues towards something, and the justification for them typically is that, well, those are future revenues that you wouldn't get if you don't get that development. In this case, I think where you're expanding a district that they've already agreed on, the development that's going to happen outside that district presumably is quote unquote already going to happen because it's being spurred by the stadium itself. And so in this case, they will be giving up something. They will be giving up property tax revenue that they otherwise would have gotten, that would have gone to the city and to the county. And so, that is a cost of sorts to the taxpayer, even though it doesn't come directly out of the city budget or the county budget.
Well, here's an example. The boundaries to the west of the stadium will go all the way to Central Street, which is the midpoint of the old city, and up to Fifth Avenue. Well, that area includes the old Greyhound bus station, which David Dewhurst just bought and is planning to redevelop. Hasn't redeveloped it yet. So presumably, or at least potentially, the increased tax revenues from what Greyhound has been paying and what Dewhurst Properties will pay once they redevelop that property, that chunk of money would go toward paying off this loan for the stadium instead of just into the general coffers.
Right. Well, and the other effect it has is that because you can only have one TIF, and so all of those buildings, all of those properties within that TIF district, their TIF is already essentially set, and it's going, and it would be, I mean, this all has to be approved, obviously.
Right, yes.
But it would be going to the stadium. What that means is for somebody like Dewhurst, if he wants to come and develop that Greyhound station, now David Dewhurst himself has developed a lot of projects that have had TIFs for the project itself, he won't have access to that. He won't be able to get a TIF on that Greyhound building because that money is already going to be committed. It doesn't mean that the city may not have other ways to try to facilitate redevelopment, but it does. It kind of you can only use a TIF once on any given property.
Yeah, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that all works out. It's really complicated, and for instance, one thing that complicates it is, TIFs use property tax revenues. Property tax revenues can't be used to pay off bond issues related to stadiums. Well, this money is going to go toward a loan, not toward the bond issue. So, they're kind of there are more pieces to the puzzle now, and it's getting more and more complicated as it goes down the pike. And I think, like anything else, that kind of when things get complicated, people get suspicious.
And ultimately, it does increase the potential liability for city and county taxpayers because if the TIF district and these other sources don't produce sufficient revenue to pay back these loans, ultimately, the people, are the ones who are on the hook for it.
They'll take it out of existing revenues, which means other projects that are going on won't get that money. I mean, this is a zero-sum game. And now, one thing is, as you mentioned, the county commission, city council, and sports authority will all have to approve this, and they are planning to hold a public hearing on this in August. Mm-hmm. So. This month, and so there will be opportunities for the public to find out more. Of course, they'll read our story in Monday's Compass, and they'll know a lot more. And then, but there will be ample time for the public to learn more about the project, to weigh in on the project. So there'll be at least 4 public meeting opportunities, and most of them, if not all of them, this month. Mm-hmm.
And we do have city elections coming up next year. Mayor Jacobs, for example, doesn't have to worry too much about possible blowback from anything that happens here because he just got reelected.
Right.
If he's going to run for anything else, it won't be for a while, and it probably won't be in Knox County. But Mayor Kincannon in the city and 4 city council members, or 4 city council seats anyway, are up for election next year. And if they get a lot of public pushback or blowback, it could affect the way they feel about it.
Well, the timing of this announcement is kind of interesting too. We first reported on the possibility that Boyd was going to be loaning money to cover up the. Hesitate to use the word shortfall. They don't like to use that word, but the shortfall. We reported that a couple of weeks ago. Well, there's no official announcement. Nobody would go on the record to confirm that until the day after Jacobs gets reelected, and which is and still way out from when Kincannon's going to face reelection.
It's the first point after Jacobs' reelection that is also the farthest away from Kincannon's potential reelection.
So they, while we like to think that they were dragging their heels because we already knew it and reported it, and we were confident in our facts. To us, we were dragging our heels. To them, they did it at the first instant they could.
Right.
Politically.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, another thing to mention is that tomorrow, Monday, August 8th, schools reopen. Students go back to school.
Yes.
A little amazing that summer is already over, at least for our beleaguered K-12ers.
Be careful in those school zones.
Absolutely. Actually, just today, Friday morning, Superintendent John Ryswick, Sheriff Tom Spangler, and KPD Chief Paul Noel had a joint press and School Security Chief Jason Perriard had a joint press conference to talk about general school security plans for the upcoming year. One point that Chief Noel made very strongly is that KPD is going to be out there in those school zones this coming week So do yourself and the kids and everybody else a favor and go slow through those zones. The school system is reopening with a brand new school, Lonsdale Elementary, which actually we'll be talking about in our upcoming conversation with Evetty Satterfield. They're also reopening with basically no plan at all to deal with COVID. No mask mandate, certainly. They're not going to have a data dashboard as they have the last couple of years, trying to track active cases among students and staff. Those of us who are parents will no longer be receiving emails from school principals alerting us that there has been a positive case in the school. I will say, as a bit of an editorial aside, as a parent, I never found those emails particularly useful. My kids' schools, have over 1,000 kids in them, and so to hear that there is a case somewhere in the school, it does. What are you supposed to do with that information exactly? But it was a form of reporting. They're not doing any of that. And as Chalkbeat, a national education news website, reported this past week, that really puts Knox County in line with the majority of schools across the country. After a couple of years of, in some cases, many places, schools weren't even open for one whole year. Many places had mask mandates through the past school year. And now everybody's kind of done with it. Part of that is because vaccines are available for kids all the way down to the age of 6 months. And so people who want to get their kids vaccinated can in Knox County. That's not most of them. I think currently ages 5 to 11, only about a quarter of them are reported as being vaccinated. And for the older kids, it's about half. And so it'll be very interesting to see, our COVID numbers are actually relatively high in the community right now. They're higher than they've been for the start of school the last 2 years. Our hospitalization rates are still relatively low, although they have been trending up a bit. But of course, you don't need hospitalizations to disrupt schools. All you need is kids and teachers testing positive and staying home, which is what has happened the past few years. So we'll just kind of have to, I think everybody, there was a little bit of talk at the school board this past week about whether they needed to make plans, for example, extending some extra potential sick days to teachers. And they decided to not do anything and just to say, let's wait and see what happens. And I think that's kind of the position a lot of people are in these days with COVID. And so
there's a lot of COVID fatigue.
Yeah.
I think that plays a big role in this. And I think the school system is probably a little bit like other institutions. Is if we don't do anything, we're not going to make anybody mad unless the worst happens, and they're just going to keep your fingers crossed and hope the worst doesn't happen.
Right.
So,
yep. Well, and of course we wish the best to everybody, all the kids and teachers and everybody, including my own kids, heading back to school. We'll just kind of knock wood and see how it goes. Speaking of the school system, we have an interview with School Board Vice Chair Evetty Satterfield, who has for the past 4 years represented the 1st District. And we talked to her about a lot of things, including the opening of the new Lonsdale School and some of her what she views as successes on school board and some of what she views as frustrations, sometimes being a minority voice in multiple ways on the board. So let's go to the interview. All right, joining us this week for our interview is school board member Evetty Satterfield, soon to be former school board member Evetty Satterfield, who has represented the 1st District on the school board for the last 4 years, did not seek re-election this year, and so she had her final official school board meeting this past week. Evetty, thanks a lot for being with us.
For sure. Thank you. I've always enjoyed Compass Reviewing, and Jesse and Scott supporting me throughout the years by just giving me a platform to share my voice, even if it's some stuff that I did not want recorded. It happened. So I appreciate you all.
Well, we appreciate public officials who speak their minds. It makes our stories, I think, more interesting and informative to people. So you just this week had your last school board meeting and also had a ribbon cutting at Lonsdale Elementary School.
new building there, getting ready to open to students on Monday. Talk about that a little bit. You said this week that was one of your proudest accomplishments of your time in office.
Yes, specifically because that was the first challenge that I was presented in my first year of being on the school board. And so in 2018, when I started, literally the first month, if we look back, it's important to know your history, right? So before I was even elected, Lonsdale was having issues with overcrowding, and students were in the hallway sitting on buckets during their lessons. And so that wasn't an ideal environment at the beginning. So I entered into an environment where Lonsdale was already in trouble. And then in that first couple of months, they had the carbon monoxide leakage, and we had to close school because the carbon monoxide was seeping through the building and kids are coming to school. And so that was my first introduction of what school board was going to be like for the next 4 years. Had I known, I don't know if I would have stayed on, but during that time, I had to figure out, I know that there was a need. And so I'm grateful for Lonsdale community, because there was a group of people that called me from the beginning and said, hey, Evetty, we need a new school. And so I was able to work with them directly to say, I know my board members from just these few months. I know what resonates with me as a board member. This is what you need to come and say at public forum. And because in my mind, I was like, well, there's schools across the county that got a school just because people advocated for them, not because something happened or that they needed. So I knew it was possible. I just didn't know what to do. So I worked with them for them to use the language that I know resonates with board members. And then I really just did a passionate plea to my board members to say, hey, I know it's on the capital plan, but we weren't even supposed to look at it till 2022. And I had to make a motion to move it up on the capital plan to say, let's include Lonsdale as one of the schools that's getting built within this the next couple of years. And so in that, I also supported Adrian Burnett in the Northwest School as well. So that was the first taste of politics, of how to give and take to get what you actually need. So that taught me a lot. Again, that was year one. So being able to see it happen, and not even see it happen as it got approved, but being able for it to be open and scholars going to school on Monday is just God just smiling down on me. I really feel like that was like, good job, girl. So that is really how I feel.
Put a bow on your whole.
For literally the last moment of it. And I think that's God also being funny. It's like, I'm not going to show you until the end, because the other schools have delayed, right? My school could have been delayed, but they're there. And just the joy and the atmosphere on Monday, it made it all worth it, honestly, when it's all said and done. And that's going to be there forever, because I don't think they're going to get another school no time soon. So
that building goes back to the 1930s. The old one goes back to the 1930s, right? So it's been like 90 years since there's been a new school there. Well, so you represent the first district, which of course includes East Knoxville, downtown, stretches across to Mechanicsville and Lonsdale. You are a graduate of Austin East High School yourself, and your tenure included, obviously, this very difficult year last year at Austin East, where there was just a rash of gun violence in the community and 5 students lost their lives. I guess, how hard was that for you, both as a community member, but also, having the responsibility to be the voice of that community then on the school board?
Yeah, it was a difficult time. And every time I think about it, or like read off the names, or just put myself back into that experience, I get emotional, because that was a heavy, hard time. And to, again, being from the community and knowing the families that are affected, knowing the cousins, the friends, the people that I went to school with, it's close. It was right at home, even though I am in this elected official position. So I felt it twice. I felt it in a sense of like, this is my family, this is my community. I grieve, not just because their kids are lost, but I know these kids. But then also on the other end of, I'm fighting against a system that, as you remember during that time, I was like, even if the MOA doesn't change, just do a front to say, okay, we're going to act like we care. And
talking about the relationship with the police department.
Yeah, with the police department, right? And all, and just the community. That I was telling people that my community is grieving and want just a space to share what's going on. why can't we create that space, right? And so that, even just being in that battle, knowing what I'm feeling on the ground, but also being in the battle of trying to figure out like a space where elected officials can hear the voices and it getting shut down, that was really tough as well, because you do feel defeated. And I remember distinctly saying that to some friends. I was like, I feel defeated and I'm the person that's in the position to get something done. So I can only imagine what the people who lost their kids, the people who are in our community that feel voiceless, if I felt that way and I'm in the position to actually, where people think I can get it done. So that was a hard time. That was a hard time. I'm grateful I made it through, but that's a piercing in the soul, if I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, one thing about that is and this kind of is a question that connects what you were talking about with Lonsdale and what had happened in East Knoxville at Austin East last year. The language that you need to use to be effective, is there something that the Austin East community, people in East Knoxville, can learn from what happened in Lonsdale to affect change in a more longer lasting way?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I do. So something that I told myself, had I ran again, I would have created like a task force, not a task force, but like just people in communities that I'll say, hey, this is in different communities within my district, that I can say, hey, I need this to help me push certain things, right? So those key pillar people, but I will be in frequent communication with them now that I know what it took to get things done in a district, and maybe 5 or 6 people versus a whole community trying to push out, right? Because there's opinions that are there. I hear directly what you're asking, Scott, and I do think that there is language that you have to use. That's something that I learned in my term, that especially in the climate that we're in, like certain ways of saying things and certain things you have to say for it to resonate and for people to not get defensive. And I think that was just a really emotionally high climate time, to where I don't know, there are no answers, right? Everybody, you're either going to stand up and do right in leadership, or you're going to protect yourself, and because you don't know what to do. And so we're just not going to do anything. And I really feel like that's what ended up happening. We don't know what to do, so we just won't do anything.
You also were a big advocate for the disparities in educational outcomes effort, which goes back 8 years at this point. And you tried earlier this year to, along with former Superintendent Bob Thomas, to kind of codify that effort, a commitment to equity by the school board. And of course, the board majority was not in favor of creating an equity policy. And of course, now we have a new superintendent. I guess as you're leaving, what are your hopes for that whole effort around equity? And also, do you have any concerns about whether it's, in the absence of a policy, whether it's going to continue to be a priority?
Yeah, so even how that rolled out from the beginning, it was probably like a 5-6 month ordeal that I was just like, again, politics and everything, how it was even introduced, that is not how I would have introduced it. Because I have a muscle that's different from white men or white women of how to navigate certain things, especially because I'm a Black woman. I've had to figure this out all my life, right? And so even how it was introduced from the jump, I knew it wasn't going to have much success. I wasn't sure if it was going to completely be cut down like it was, but I knew we didn't roll it out effectively. So my ultimate goal of just keeping it going for 5 months was to bring it to because equity's happening in our schools, regardless if we acknowledge it or not. Like that's the premise of being an educator. Like that's what you do. You don't have to call it what you call it, but you modify your academic learning to the kids that are there. That's just what you do if you're a teacher. And so I know it's happening in our schools. It's happening in my district, at every district. Can it happen better in different districts? Absolutely. But I know Superintendent Reiswick's focus is that, and he's going to continue to push that. So when I got in a space of knowing that our schools are doing what they need to do, regardless of what the board does, my role was just continuing to push it for 5 months to, one, force people to a vote, but also bring awareness to our community, like have the conversation. And I think that is how you can also use policy, regardless if it passes or not, is that the community is now talking about this equity policy that never talked about it before. And so that was my goal once I realized it's not going to really pass, is how do we elevate what's actually happening in our schools to the board level to eventually community members can keep this on the back of their radar that didn't go to the DEO meetings and have no idea what this is. Now we're having a 5-month discussion about an equity policy that didn't get passed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and you also, of course, your term included the COVID pandemic, or I guess part of it. We're still in it, apparently. And I felt like there was a point where you seemed to get really frustrated with that whole, the ongoing fight over whether there were going to be masks and this and that. And that was happening at kind of the same time you were dealing with all of, these issues of violence in the community. I guess, what was your perception of that and your experience of kind of navigating through that?
Jesse, had I known that was the outcome of all of that, I don't think I ever would have put forth that mask policy, because it was me that brought the mask policy up, because I wasn't supporting opening schools in the middle of a pandemic. Like, nobody knew it was anything. And so I said, okay, well, if we're going to open schools, can we bring a mask policy? So I worked and presented that mask policy, and the board voted on it. 2 years later, had no idea. I think I don't know if anybody could really understand what it felt like in that room as a Black woman. I remember going to the meeting when we were in the city county building, and that whole time I would literally just sleep all day because my body was reacting to what I was about to come into. And so I knew I was safe because of where we're at, and I knew nothing was going to happen to me in reality, but my body felt endangered. So when you're at a table at the board meeting and you're looking at a crowd of seeing just angry faces, angry white faces with flags flying, like that is sending a message to me that I know my history and I know the history of Black people in this community. And that is what my body felt, right? So we're thinking about the traumas in our body. There was many times where I physically felt unsafe. Now, nothing happened to me, and I'm grateful for that, but it was a hard time. And when I realized that I am having these emotions and I'm not, it's more like self-preservation. So as you've seen, I also got detached. And I just kind of checked out from mask conversation. So when I said, I'm not talking about masks no more, you didn't hear anything else about me about masks. And I passed on every vote. Like, I was just done, because I could not continue to put my mental and my body into that space, because it literally wore on me in a sense that I felt endangered, like my health,
Yeah, I understand. Scott,
well, one thing about about COVID, and this kind of a broader countywide thing, is Knox County's numbers among African American residents are actually better than they are nationally. In that the Black community in Knoxville really stepped up and really made fighting COVID a point of emphasis. And that seems to be something that the broader community, in parts of the broader community, didn't embrace as much. And yet there are actual tangible results in that the disease burden in the African American community is about what you would expect from the community at large, and isn't disproportionately affected. And but that was an intentional thing, because there were so many people in the African American community who pushed wearing masks and getting vaccinated and all.
Yeah,
those
there
things.
was a huge front from leadership. And that's why I say, like, our community bands together, regardless. It might look different from what society deems as what you should band together, but we knew where the vaccine clinics were. We knew who was leading the vaccine clinics. There was organizations that was part of it and pushing it out. Cynthia Finch was huge in that. And I will also say, I didn't have any issues in my schools about wearing masks. Like, those kids wore masks, and there wasn't an issue. It was like, we're not, and I and I think this is what you've seen at the board meeting. Like, wearing a mask is not a big deal for people who have fought for rights. Like, this is not infringing on our rights if you're asking me to put a mask. And you really saw, and I know I got some backlash about people and their privilege, but you really saw how people have been able to walk through American society without having any type of infringement on their rights, because this was such a big deal. And I still don't understand it. Like, if I want to get on a plane and go to a different state and the requirement is to put on a mask, I'm put on a mask. Like, it's just 1 + 1 = 2. But I've realized that was not my fight, and I checked out.
So, and this may be a hard question to answer off the top of your head, but from your 4 years of experience that you've had now as an elected official, I guess, what's your biggest, or a couple of the biggest takeaways about what it takes to be a successful and effective, public representative?
Yeah, I do feel like I was successful, and I do feel like I had an impact. And I will say it takes a lot of self-awareness, and that's something that I've always worked on throughout my life. But I realized that I had to understand my board members, and I had to understand their perspective and modify what I wanted to present and create to their perspectives, because they don't have to. I was the one that had to get things pushed. I was the one that had to do things different in our system. So I had to modify and present in a language where they understood and didn't feel like they were being attacked. Because public officials, that's the first thing. You don't want to feel like, you don't want to be your back up against the wall and having to make a public defense. So not being embarrassed, right? So I had to and I think you can quickly blame and put people in positions where they just feel embarrassed and don't know what to do. And you're not going to get anywhere with that. So I had to understand it. This is the term, this term I use, just, you know me. I had to find my white empathy to really be able to communicate with people who do not have this muscle, but also they care, they want to do it, they just don't know how. So I had to work 2 times as hard, like they always say, to get the work done, but also present it in a way where they don't know what's happening. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But I think self-awareness and understanding people's perspectives and their lived stories and communicating through that language, I think that's what made my time successful at the board.
Yeah, and you ended up getting elected vice chair your last year, which, obviously shows support and relationships with other board members.
Yeah, we went out to eat last week, and Gary Dupler he was like, I don't think there's ever been a time where everybody liked each other like this. and that's what they said. They was like, I believe that this is a gift that I have, but I have an ability, a synergy of just like, it's not that big of a deal, y'all. We can disagree, but we're all here, right? Even as you see Mike's comments, he was like, we didn't ever agree, but I liked you. I was like, that's fine. And I think that's what it takes, right? You can't take it personal. Can't take any of this personal.
Mm-hmm. So you decided not to run for re-election this year because you had some professional changes of your own. What are you doing now?
Yeah, I thought about running, and I don't know if I had 4 more years in me. I might have had 2 more years in me, but another 4 years, I can't. And I think that, I don't know if that's just generational but I have relocated. So I run a consulting firm called Advancing Lives, and we support schools and nonprofits with moving their culture forward. And so there's one of my clients that I've been working with for 2 years. They created a position. So I'm working at a school in St. Louis as the director of community culture and strategy, and really just creating what do our kids need in the society that we live in right now outside of academics. And so I'm excited about the opportunity. It will be a matter of time before I really tap into the community and start getting to work like I know, just because of just who I am. But this is a community I'm familiar with. I went to grad school here. I went to Washington University in St. Louis. So it's my second home.
Uh-huh. Well, best wishes with that. And is there any possibility that some future job might bring you back to Knoxville?
Oh, Knoxville got a lot of work before they get me back. Keep doing good work. I might come back. I don't know. Knoxville's yeah. I'm grateful for my time in Knoxville. I know for a fact the leadership that I've gained over these last 4 years is I would have only been able to get it in Knoxville. And I'm also a young professional that has other things that they want to desire to do, like have a social life, that's not really there for me in Knoxville. And so maybe when I retire, Jesse, I'll come back.
All right. Well, we'll try to work on making it more attractive. Well, thanks again for talking with us. And thanks also for always being accessible during your time on the board and being candid about your thoughts about things. Certainly appreciate that. So best wishes to you.
Thank you.
Look, Evan.
Thank you all.
All right, and thanks again to Evetty for talking with us. We should mention that her successor has now been decided. It had not yet been officially at the time we talked to her, but Reverend John Butler, Democratic candidate, will be representing the 1st District on the school board. Now it is time for our Q&A portion of the podcast, where every week we invite readers on our subscriber-only Facebook group, The Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you are a Compass subscriber, or if you become a Compass subscriber. And you can find subscription information at CompassKnox.com. And on our subscriber-only Facebook group every week, we invite readers to suggest ideas, topics, things that they would like us to address on the podcast. We had a question this week about the disposition of the Andrew Johnson building, because there was a little bit of news. Knox County announced this past week that the sale of that building to Nashville developers BNA has officially closed, ending a 5-year process. The county first put that building up for bid 5 years ago. They first selected BNA as the purchasers and developers of it 4 years ago in 2018 under former, this was even before County Mayor Glenn Jacobs took office. And then it took a long time to work everything out. The school system had occupied that building since the county bought it in 1991. And of course, we're talking about, if you're not familiar with the Andrew Johnson building, it is the 18-story historic 1929 building right at the south end of Gay Street, right before you go over the Gay Street Bridge. Has been owned by the county for about 30 years. And this was an effort to get it back into private hands, get it back on the tax rolls, and they accomplished that by arranging a lease with the Tennessee Valley Authority for their then empty East Tower, which is now called the UT Tower, because it's occupied by Knox County Schools in the lower half and the upper half by University of Tennessee administration. And part of what Randy Boyd, UT President Randy Boyd, negotiated as part of their lease was they wanted to be able to name it the UT Tower, so that's what it is now. And that meant that the county could finally move forward with going ahead and selling the building to BNA. So the question that we got was, is this a good deal? Mm-hmm. And that was a question that was actually asked a lot by particularly members of county commission as they were debating it over the course of a year or so. They're selling it for $6 million. $6 million doesn't necessarily sound like a whole lot when you look at this, big
18-story building,
grand landmark building. It's on the National Historic Register. It's got some lore that goes along with it. It was opened as a hotel in 1929, and BNA is proposing to turn it back into a hotel that they're going to call the Hotel Americana. At least that's the current plan. According to legend/myth, it's the last place that Hank Williams Sr. ever spent the night. He left there in the middle of the night and turned up dead in the back seat of a car some hours later. Various notable people stayed there over the years. And so this question, I think, of is this a good deal is an interesting one because it kind of depends on what you mean, right?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, there's the financial aspect, I think, is what immediately leaps to mind. You know, the county spent a lot of money to get out of it. So you know, it's not just oh, they sold the building and moved on. You know that, you know, and you know, they sold the building. It didn't bring in a whole lot of money, and the you know, the tax incentive that they're going to give to get this.
Right, they're giving it a 17-year pilot, which means that the property taxes they collect on it for that period are going to be pretty low.
Yeah, they're going to be low. So there's not going to realize okay, $1 a year would be $1 a year more than that property's generated for the past 30
right,
years.
because it's been publicly
owned. So, but they are, you know, they're not going to realize the full extent of the property taxes on this redeveloped piece of property for 17 years. So you can look at it and say it's not such a great deal, but you can also look at it and say that it is a good deal. And one of the things that gets lost in talking about is this a good deal or not is what will it do? Mm-hmm. What will this change actually do? One of the things, when you look at that end, the south end of downtown, close to the river, it's almost all government buildings.
Yeah.
You've got the city county building, you've got the federal courthouse, you got the state Supreme Court building, you've got the John Duncan building.
Yep.
You know, and there's church down there, a couple of big tall buildings. There's not much street activity. You've got the Bijou and the Bistro at the Bijou,
and that's kind of as far south as any
that's as far
entertainment south or nightlife or anything.
Right.
Goes
So this is going to bring a lot of activity in that area, and there are going to be people who are going to be staying in this hotel who are going to be going up the street, up Gay Street, to the other businesses that are at that end of Gay Street, which, you know, the difference between what goes on in the south end of Gay Street and the north end of Gay Street downtown is huge. Mm-hmm. And so it will bring I'm not going to say will, it should bring some vibrancy, some new, you know, ground floor businesses, people who are going to be in that area, who could also create other opportunities in that area. So,
sure.
So if you want to look at it from a vibrancy standpoint, then it's probably a good deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it also, because whether the county kept the building or not, it needed a lot of work. It needed to be renovated. Anybody who was in the building while the school system was there knows that it was pretty much a hodgepodge. I mean, when the school system moved into it, they put up a bunch of walls and dividers and weird places because, you know, converting a hotel to an office building, which is essentially what they did, is tricky, and there were a lot of weird corners to it and everything. It never functioned really well as an office building, and it's very old. You know, it's going on. It'll be 100 years old in 7 more years, and so the county also would have had to spend money just for basic maintenance and renovation. But what's going to happen now, what the developers have proposed, is a full renovation with great respect for for the historic nature of the building and trying to preserve as much as they can of its various historic features. And this group, BNA, this is not the first time they've done this in Knoxville. They also own and operate and renovated the Oliver Hotel on Market Square, another historic property. And so people who kind of want to get some idea of what the Andrew Johnson might turn into, you know, you can check out the Oliver, because it's going to be it'll be larger, but still the same kind of boutique hotel experience. Right. It's going to have restaurants and bars, things that will draw people, as you say, down there, not just the people who are staying there. But for people who really value historic preservation and renovation and protecting these old buildings, that's a net benefit itself. It's not one that it's easy to put a price on, to say,
Right.
what's this worth to the average taxpayer? But if you're somebody who cares about historic preservation, which certainly Knoxville
Yes.
has plenty of those, there are some clear benefits there too.
Right.
So, is it a good deal? To a certain degree, it's in the eye of the beholder. One thing I think is worth mentioning also about that $6 million purchase price. First of all, that was agreed to 4 years ago,
Right.
in 2018. If they put it back out for bid now, it's possible that would come in higher. On the other hand, the amount of money that's going to have to be spent to fix it up has also gone up.
Right.
Because as we know, construction and everything else has gotten more expensive. So it's hard to say. But County Mayor Glenn Jacobs' argument about it has been that, look, these developers, made this bid in good faith 4 years ago and were selected 4 years ago, and it's been essentially entirely the county's fault that it's taken this long to get the deal finalized. And he was saying that the developers shouldn't be punished for being willing to wait around while all that got sorted out. All right, so moving on to the coming week, not a whole lot on the civic calendar, but there are a couple of meetings to talk about.
Yeah, we've got a city council meeting on Tuesday and a planning commission meeting on Thursday. Neither has an extensive agenda. One of the interesting things that's going to be on the city council agenda is kind of a rarity these days. It's an annexation.
Wow. We still do those?
Well, very rarely, and only when the property owner requests them, because that's state law now. Back when Mayor Victor Ashe was in office, he engaged in finger annexation. So when you look at a map of the city of Knoxville, you see all these tentacles going out along the thoroughfares.
Taking in prime commercial real estate.
Yes, taking in
mostly.
prime commercial real estate. And then when Bill Haslam took office as mayor, he pretty much stopped annexations. And then now it's against the law to annex without the owner's consent. But there are owners in this is property that is next to Alcoa Highway at Maloney Road in South Knoxville. We've talked about the South Knoxville, or the Alcoa Highway plan that was just recently been adopted by both the commission and city council. But this is a request to get this property into the city, and so they're going to be willingly paying more property taxes at this development. I'm not. It's going to be a commercial development. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to entail at this point. But that's going in. Another development issue that council is going to be considering, and another one we've spoken about before, is the Giffin School redevelopment project in South Knoxville, in South Haven neighborhood. It won't be controversial, and primarily because it's being kind of touted as a poster for how developers and neighborhoods should interact. The developer had gone into Giffin Elementary School. It's a historic school. It's kind of run down. Speaking of historic preservation, but it's kind of run down. Was going to renovate the building and add 4 other buildings, I believe. I think there were going to be a total of 5 buildings. People in the neighborhood got upset. The South Haven Neighborhood Association, they were very much opposed to that, but the developer and the neighborhood association got together. He reconfigured the plans, reduced the number of units, reduced the number of buildings, and they came to an agreement. And so council is going to be giving its final approval on that development plan on Tuesday. Then on Thursday, when the planning commission meets, we've got we talked about the Andrew Johnson building on the south end of downtown, the north end of downtown. Up on Summit Hill near Immaculate Conception Church, Lawler Wood has got some property up there. They haven't announced plans what they're going to do with it, but it's going to have to be rezoned for something, probably a residential or mixed use development. It's right up by the Eagles Lodge up there on Summit Hill. So and Summit Hill has seen quite a bit of pre-development activity. This would be the third major development to go in, assuming that it is going to be as major as the property would suggest.
Right.
So so that's
more growth, more development.
More growth, more development. There are a couple out in West Knox County too that are coming up. One out in the Choteau area that's a lot of fast growth. There's another one in Fair. It's kind of odd. It's a piece of property that straddles the Farragut city limits. So part of it's in Farragut, part of it's outside of Farragut. The developer wants to go in and put in medium density housing, basically an apartment building and or an apartment complex. And the planning commission staff has recommended against it because the area it's going into is mostly single family houses. So it'd be interesting to see one of the tensions in development in the county's been density and there's been a call for more density. Here's an opportunity, and will the planning commissioners vote for density or against it? I mean, that's essentially what it boils down to. So, be interesting to see. There'll probably be some other rezoning battles and such, as there just about always are.
All right. Well, and we'll have coverage of anything interesting that happens and all of that at CompassKnox.com, and we will be back here next week to talk about what happens next week. For now, I think I'm going to go try to catch up on some sleep.
Well, I'm going to go. It's still mid-afternoon on Friday as we're taping this. I've still got some stuff to track down on that stadium deal. So
no rest for the weary.
No rest for the weary, and so hopefully, we talked about it a little bit today. Tomorrow's story, Monday's story, should be have a few more juicy details
and
about
we'll
what's
probably
going
talk
on.
about that.
And we'll talk about it again next week
week's
too.
episode too.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks as always to our producer, Lord Seth Barber of Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by William Wright, and we will talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.